Once upon a time, long, long ago, men and dwarves lived together beneath the roof of one great city. Some said it was the oldest and greatest city in the world and had existed before the time of the Longbeards and the Manlings. Built by older and wiser hands in the dawn of the world. The city lay both above and below the earth, in keeping with the nature of the populace that dwelt there. The dwarves ruled in their great halls of stone below the ground and wrestled the fruits of the rock free with their day-long toil, while the Manlings reaped the fields of swaying corn that surrounded the city with a patchwork blanket of gold. The sun smiled, men laughed, and everyone was happy. One day, the men of the city decided that they should give praise to their gods for their good fortunes. They planned a temple, such as the world had never seen before. In the central square, a colossal hall would be built and topped with a single cloud-piercing tower. A tower so tall it would touch the very heart of the heavens. And after much planning, and with the help of the Longbeards, they set about their monumental task. Weeks became months, and months became years, and still the Manlings built. Men grew old and grey, working on that great temple, their sons continuing their work through summer sun and winter rain. At last, after many generations, work began on the great spire itself. Years passed, and the tower reached such a height that the Manlings found it ever more difficult to take the stone up to the top. Eventually, the work slowed to a crawl, and finishing the tower seemed impossible. Then one came among the men of the city, who offered his help in their great scheme. He asked for a single boon of them in return, and claimed that if they would grant him this, he would complete the tower in a single night. The Manlings said to themselves, "What have we to lose?" and offered to make a bargain with the grey-clad stranger. All he wished was to add his own dedication to the gods onto the temple structure. The Manlings agreed, and the bargain was struck. At dusk, the stranger entered the unfinished temple and bade the Manlings to return at midnight. Clouds swept over the moons, cloaking the temple in darkness as the Manlings left. All over the city, men watched and waited as the hours slipped past until near midnight. By ones and twos, they gathered again in the temple square. The wind blew, and the clouds parted as they gazed up at the temple. It rose like an unbroken lance against the sky, pure and white. And at its very peak, a great horned bell hung gleaming coldly in the moonlight. The stranger's dedication to the gods was there, but of the stranger himself, there was no sign. The Manlings rejoiced that their father's work was done. They surged forward to enter the temple. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the great bell began to toll. Once, twice, thrice. Slow, heavy waves of sound rolled across the city. 4, 5, 6 times the bell rang, like the torpid pulse of a bronze giant. 7, 8, 9, the rolling of the bell grew louder with each ring, and the manlings staggered back from the temple, steps clutching their ears. 10, 11, 12, 13. At the 13th stroke, lightning split the skies and thunder echoed through the night. High above, the dark circle of Morsleep was lit by a bright flash, and all fell ominously silent. The manlings fled to their beds, frightened and puzzled by the portents they had seen. Next morning, they arose to find that the darkness had come to their city. Brooding storm clouds reared above the rooftops, and such rain fell as had never been seen before. Black, like ash, the rain fell and puddled in the streets, slicking the cobbles with darkly iridescent colours. At first, some of the manlings didn't worry. They waited for the rain to stop so that they may resume their work. But the rain did not stop. The winds blew stronger, and lightning shook the high tower. Days stretched into weeks, and still the rain did not stop. Each night the bell tolled 13 times, and each morning the darkness lay across the city. The manlings became fearful and prayed to their gods. Still the rains did not stop, and the black clouds hung like a shroud over the fields of flattened corn. The manlings went to the dwarfs and beseeched their help. The Longbeards were unconcerned. What matter a little rain on the surface? In the bosom of the earth all was warm and dry. Now the manlings huddled in their dwelling, fear gnawing at their hearts. They sent some of their number to faraway places to seek help, but none of them returned. Some went to the temple to pray and sacrifice their dwindling food to the gods, but they found the temple door closed to them. The rain grew heavier. Dark hailstones fell from the sky and crushed the sodden crops. The great bell tolled a death knell over the terrified city. Soon, great stones cleft the heavens, rushing down like dark meteors to smash the homes of the manlings. Many sickened and died from no apparent cause, and the newborn babies of the manlings were hideously twisted. Skulking vermin devoured what little stored corn there was left, and the manlings began to starve. The manling elders went to see the dwarfs again, and this time demanded their help. They wanted to bring their folk below ground to safety. They wanted food. The Longbeards grew angry and told the manlings that the lower workings were flooded and their food had also been devoured by rats. There remained barely enough food and shelter for them and their kinsmen. They cast the manlings out of their halls and closed the doors once more. In the ruins of the city above, each day became more deadly than the last. The manlings despaired and called for succor from the dark gods, whispered the names of forgotten demon princes in the hope of salvation. But none came. Instead, the vermin returned, bigger and bolder than ever. Their slinking, furred shapes infested the broken city, feasting on the fallen and pulling down the weak. Each midnight, the bell tolled 13 times on high, seeming now brazen and triumphant. The manlings lived as hunted creatures in their own city, as great rat packs roamed the streets in search of them. At last, the desperate manlings took up such weapons as they had and beat upon the dwarf's door, threatening that if they did not emerge, they would drag them out by their beards. No reply came from within. The manlings took up beams and battered down the doors to reveal the tunnels below, dark and empty, stealing themselves the pitiful remnants of the city's once proud populace descended. In the ancient hall of kingship, they found the dwarves, now naught but gnawed bones and scraps of cloth. And there they saw, by the dying light of their torches, the myriad eyes about them, glittering like liquid midnight as the rats closed in for the kill. The manlings stood back to back and fought for their lives, but against such implacable ferocity and countless numbers of the verminous horde, their weapons were useless. The tide of monstrous rats flowed over them, one by one, dragging them down to be torn apart. The yellow, chiseled teeth sinking into their soft flesh, the dark, toughed mass drowning their pitiful screams with their hideous chittering. That, my friends, is part of an old Chilean tale about the fall of a great city, where a literal metropolis was apparently destroyed by simple rats. Naturally, the Chileans believe this tale, due to close proximity to the now barren wasteland which was Kavzar. They have faced the horrors which lurk below, and while many across the old world claim this story is simply just a story to scare children and adults alike, we know better. We know the Skaven lurk below, and they are coming. The Skaven are a race of humanoid-like ratmen who show such cruelty and malice that many who do believe their existence are absolutely terrified of encountering them. They must not make their fears known to the general public, however, as those who speak openly about the Skaven are normally branded heretics and are quickly never seen again, either by the governing bodies or by the ratmen themselves. As the Skaven are secretive, they only wish to make themselves known only when the time is right, and that time is coming soon. Many argue as to what truly are the Skaven. Are they beastmen, mutated servants of chaos, or perhaps something more? What manner of dark god could create such beings? When did they appear in this world? The Skaven look like large bipedal rats, roughly man-sized in fact. However, future breeds of Skaven, in particular the many forms of mutations, can be much larger, some even being larger than dragons. Their fine, thick fur, as you can imagine, provides them with warmth. Why this is an important point to note, you may ask? Well, having a natural form of warmth allows the Skaven to spread with relative ease. Their fur, acting as natural clothing, will allow them to survive the harsh lands of the north, and perhaps the frozen chaos wastes themselves. The location of Clan Moulder's capital, the Hell Pit, which can be found in the northern reaches of the Old World in Kislev, is the perfect example for this, as Kislev is mostly frozen and barren. Having thick fur naturally would give the Skaven an advantage over the freezing temperatures, and allow them to conduct their experiments with little hindrance. Skaven, as the same as the simple rat, vary in fur colouring, brown and black being the most common, while white and grey being the least. It is with this that the Skaven society is formed, with the more common fur colourings being lesser rank than the least common. In very special occasions, a brown-furred Skaven can rise up the ranks and eventually find himself in a position of power. While you would have a bigger advantage being born with white fur, for example, as such fur would mark you as being a strong warrior, especially were you fully albino, as you would be recruited into the prestigious albino storm vermin. It is more than possible for a clan rat, or even a simple Skaven slave, to rise through the ranks into a position of power, eventually either ruling over a small clan or taking control over a larger, more well-known clan. Obviously, this requires a lot of deception and strategy, and some Skaven may not live to see all that they have worked hard on to come to fruition. This is because the average lifespan of the Skaven is incredibly low, with most accounts stating around 20 years. Now, given their average lifespan, we must look at the following. Why do they live so little? The first thing we need to address is that this is the average lifespan, meaning that the Skaven can actually live longer with both natural and unnatural means. We know of Skaven living to be hundreds of years old. Some have used special concoctions. Some have simply augmented their bodies with means of engineers and warpstone. And others, miraculously, have just managed to survive. Be it surviving an attack by one of the races of the Old World, a failed experiment, or an assassination attempt by one of their fellow kin. A big point there is that the Skaven always strive to assert their dominance over each other, and thus will happily attempt to kill each other should they see the perfect opening in order to take one's rank. Lack of food also takes this to account. And yes, while almost all the races in the Warhammer world require food to obviously stay alive, the Skaven require much, much more. They are extremely active and thus burn energy much quicker than the other races. Lack of food leads to starvation, and starvation for the Skaven naturally leads to cannibalism. Cannibalism in Skaven society is very common, and it is seen as an almost natural occurrence. If you are dead, then what use do you have other than being just food? Seeing as the Skaven are so prone to dying, many wonder how they simply didn't just die out. And the answer is simple. They bred, excuse the pun, like rats. Yes, while female Skaven are very rarely ever seen or even heard of, they do exist, mostly being confined to the dark cavernous regions of Skaven cities, where they will constantly produce more and more warriors for the Skaven armies. Many who believe the tale known as the Doom of Kavzar believe that it was during this time that the notorious Ratmen came into existence. That the simple stranger was indeed the herald of their coming. Naturally, many records of this happening has been lost through time, and many will argue the true origins, and in truth, we will never know, and through no fault of our own. You see, the Skaven care little for history. Their secretive nature disallows them from keeping any records of their past, for they do not care about the past. The Skaven only care about the present, where they do not rule the world, and the future, where they will claim the world and rule it, where the world would be overrun by ratmen in service to a dark god so vicious and cruel that the Chaos Gods themselves have started to take notice. But we'll discuss this horrible god a little later in the video. Some Skaven do look back in their past, but only to their own personal achievements. This is obviously a way for them to boast and once again remind a particular clan that they serve or rule why they do so. An example of this could be if there was an uprising in a minor Skaven clan where a lower ranking Skaven clan rat has gathered enough support in an attempt to seize control. The leader of said clan, provided he squashed the rebellion and took captives, may hold a public display for his fellow clan rats, where he would then remind them as to why exactly he rules and what led him to this position. The captives would then be eaten by the warlord and his so-called loyal rats. This is a tactic used to make any other Skaven thinking of an uprising to think twice, for should they fail, there would be nothing but food. In truth, most dead Skaven are quickly viewed as food. To further the point placed before, the Skaven care little for the past. Once you have died, you are, in the Skaven's eyes, a relic of the past. You will never be buried. There is an extremely little chance you will be remembered for anything you have done. You will simply have become food, and once you have been eaten, you have been forgotten. It is important to note that once a Skaven starts getting along with age, especially a lower ranking Skaven, or should a Skaven start getting sick, his fellow clan rats will start to look at him, and they'll simply wait until he passes. But should they be extra hungry, they might just end him right there and then, knowing that he can't defend himself. Naturally, cannibalism works well for the Skaven, as they wish to keep as secretive as possible for most of the time. The dead are eaten and their equipment is scavenged, lest the races of the surface world know too much about them, and in turn find ways to fight them, or worse, destroy them. If a Skaven force finds themselves losing and being defeated, their bodies will not last on the battlefield long, for shortly after the battle has been lost and the enemies have dispersed, many more Skaven, once it is safe of course, will attempt to reclaim the weaponry and the newfound food, to make sure it doesn't fall onto the hands of the enemy. The defeated clan, if fully destroyed, or if its remnants were absorbed into another clan, will be forgotten about, as if they never existed. On occasion, the other races will attempt to keep Skaven equipment, bodies and relics to study and learn more about this race. But usually, this doesn't end well, as the Skaven assassins are quickly dispatched to make sure their existence remains as secretive as possible. Naturally, we know Skaven have a rich history, filled with much fighting, destruction, and many, many horrors. For when the city of Kavzar fell to these giant rats, they began to grow more and more. Large numbers of Skaven banded together to form what we now know as clans, and naturally, they began to fight amongst themselves. As they bred more and more, supplies dwindled, so each of these so-called clans would attempt to attack each other in bids to take their supplies and generate an extra food source, of course. The city of Kavzar, or better yet said, the now ruined city of Kavzar, was given a new name by its new populace. Kavzar was now known as Skaven Blight, and Skaven Blight became a place where war and disease ran rampant. The Skaven's numbers were becoming innumerable, but what good was this if they were simply destroying themselves? Many Skaven would wish to journey to the surface to search for supplies, but the clan's leaders would quickly dismiss the thought. Yes, they were numerous, but they were in no means ready to fight the races of the surface. They were much stronger, so they would have to bide their time. The Skaven were still a young race, still learning the art of crafting armor and weapons, and until they had at least a novice's level of experience, they would not have equipment to fight the massive greenskins on the surface. Now, it is quick to assume that the Skaven were not doing much in their seclusion, but this is far from the case. You see, there is a particular resource which is actively sought out by the Skaven. This is Warpstone. Pure, physical chaotic energy. We'll cover Warpstone in far greater detail in a future video. But in short, Warpstone is a physical manifestation of chaotic energy. Many of the races of the Warhammer world would avoid this magical substance for fear that its chaotic properties, as there is no telling what the slightest contact with it will even do to you. You could mutate, explode, and so much more. The possibilities are truly endless. The Skaven, however, care little for their own well-being, and have become quite obsessed with this substance, putting it into use in almost every aspect of their lives, using it as currency, creating machines of war, mutating fellow Skaven to turn them into horrifying monsters, and so much more. It was around this time, still many years before the coming of Sigmar's mortal form, that the Skaven came up with a plan. While they were still too weak to capture the surface world, they would control the lands under them. They wished to create a mighty empire which would eventually be known as the Skaven Under Empire. This empire would span across the furthest reaches of the world, and from there, when they were ready, they would strike, and the great ascendancy would finally begin. It was then that many of the clans of Skavenblight joined together, working to create a massive machine that would allow a vast tunnel system to be created, which would span across the entire world. Resources were spread thin, as anything available was put to this machine. Timber, stone, warpstone, even flesh and bone. But eventually, this great machine was constructed. The time had come for the Skaven to expand and eventually take over the world. But, unfortunately, as is common with most Skaven machinery, the machine failed. But to a catastrophic degree. As can be expected, when working with the extremely volatile resource known as warpstone, a machine failing would be much more destructive. An explosion happened as quick as a blink from an eye. This explosion was so powerful that many Skaven were eviscerated. The blast wave was felt across almost the whole world, destroying even some incredibly well-built dwarf cities which dwelt under the mountains. Skavenblight, the capital of the Skaven race itself, was almost destroyed. With this, the Skaven had almost destroyed themselves. They lay broken, and infighting once again began. Many Skaven died within the space of days, with many minor Skaven clans being wiped from existence. Hope seemed to be lost for the Skaven race. But still, some of the Ratmen felt hope. They had faith that they would not be forgotten about, that their dark god was watching them. Gathering around the Great Bell Tower, the possible place of origin of all of Skavendom, it was here that the last hope of the Skaven would answer them. The cruel god of the Skaven, the Horned Rat, would make his presence known. The Horned Rat, or the Great Horned Rat as he is equally known, is the one true god of the Skaven. From him were born the Skaven, and from his will they act. He cares not for his servants, only that they follow his will, lest they suffer his wrath. He will sometimes give gifts to his servants, but this is extremely rare, as those who fail him deserve no gifts. No, those who fail him meet death with pain that only the Horned Rat himself can cause. Pain that seems to be almost exclusive to his own children. Still, the Skaven both loved and feared their destructive father, as without him they would be lost, and they would surely die out. There they stood, with what little hope they had. They waited and waited, with some Skaven even claiming that their beloved father had abandoned them. The doors to the Great Bell Tower swung open. It was then that 12 Skaven walked out, and the rest of Skavendom fell silent. They walked and spoke, but not in their own voices. No, at this point, they were merely vessels for the Great Horned Rat himself. He speaks to them, and they must obey. The Horned Rat commanded that the Skaven, despite their setback, they were to spread across the world, for the time for the Great Ascendancy was almost upon them, and they must ready themselves. The 12 Skaven, now called the Lords of Decay, were instructed to lead the Skaven as the heralds of the Horned Rat. And together, they were known as the Council of 13. 13 seats stood at this council. 12 for each Lord of Decay and whatever successor may arise to any of them. And the final seat, the 13th, was set for their terrible god, whom none could replace. With their duties given to them, the Skaven were to divide into 12 groups, each serving a Lord of Decay, and follow them to wherever they wished. The Ratmen would now spread across the world with such viciousness that no corner of the planet would be without infestation. Although the surface world had no idea, the Skaven were coming. The Skaven travelled and spread. Some were even lost to the far corners of the world as their population boomed. So did the number of clans. It is actually unknown by the Lords of Decay themselves how many Skaven clans there actually are at this point. But one thing was certain: no matter where they were, no matter how many cities they established or settled in, Skavenblight was their capital, and the Horned Rat was their one true god. All tunnels that were dug eventually lead to Skavenblight. Many of the Skaven clans had other duties. While they were to spread, many would scavenge any and all resources possible. Some others would learn the magics granted to them by their foul god, and others would seek out Warpstone, for the raw chaotic energy was one, if not the most important physical resource they require for practically anything of use to the Skaven. And it was no surprise that when it was heard that an absolutely massive deposit of Warpstone in the mountain known as Cripple Peak was found, the Council of 13 would wish to claim this for themselves. Many Skaven clans were dispatched, interestingly enough, to work in unison, something which is not common at all within Skaven kind. While some may lend aid to one another in certain degrees, it is quite common for them to quickly backstab each other the moment they see an opportunity. The task force of various clans assumed that this would be an easy job. Get the Warpstone, get out, and nobody's the wiser. However, it was at this point where the necromancer Nagash had made Cripple Peak his home and was massing an army of the living and the dead. Naturally, the Skaven were not scared of the Man-Things and launched offensive strikes against them. But Nagash was truly powerful, and when a body fell, it rose again and again and again, including some of the Skaven bodies themselves. Now no longer servants to the Horned Rat, they served the Lord of the Dead. Despite this, the Skaven would not be turned away. Their lives were expendable, and if enough Skaven were thrown at Nagash, surely, at one point, his power would dwindle. Countless skirmishes would be fought over the next 100 years or so, but then, something interesting happened. Nagash sent an envoy to the Skaven. He requested a peace treaty. The Skaven were to cease their assaults and aid Nagash, and in turn, he would have his servants mine the Warpstone and send it to them. The rats naturally wished for all the warpstone to be their own, but they knew well enough that it would be pointless fighting for another 100 years or so until someone had been defeated. So they reluctantly agreed. Obviously, the Skaven would only keep the peace for so long. This was only a temporary peace, and as usual, when they found the perfect time, they would strike. But until then, they maintained the guise of their so-called alliance. The rats were not blind to Nagash's happenings, however, for it became clear that he was raising an army like no other. An army that would be unmatched for even many millennia after his fall. The council quickly came to the realization that Nagash must be stopped, lest he rule the world as the Lord of the Dead, and all that lives will die. The council quickly looked for a Skaven with the skills to be able to take out this powerful spellcaster, but to no avail. None of the Ratmen could ever be as powerful as he was. Yet, there was hope, for they knew that Nagash had taken a single man prisoner. Who was this man? They were not sure, but he must be powerful if the Lord of the Dead kept him alive and kept him prisoner. The Skaven were to seek him out and free him, but not before a weapon strong enough to defeat Nagash was forged. A weapon forged from the purest warpstone, pure chaos. Charged by the powerful spells of Skaven magic, this weapon would destroy Nagash. And with the help of the Skaven engineers, they would bear witness to his fall. A lone Skaven assassin was quickly dispatched, with the weapon before it had even had time to cool, but time was of the essence. The prisoner, an ancient king, was released and sent to destroy Nagash with his new weapon. With the king's rage and pure will, his chaos-infused weapon, and the help from afar by the Council of 13, Nagash was eventually struck down. The necromancer lay dead, and funnily enough, the Skaven actually saved the world from certain doom. Cripple Peak was now theirs. Clan Rickek took over and renamed Cripple Peak to Fortress Rickek. The mountain was mined for its precious warpstone for years to come. With Nagash now gone, the Skaven continued to spread unhindered, spreading like a cancer, taking over Dwarf Karax, even a portion of the famed Karak 8 Peaks, a war zone divided by dwarves, greenskins and Skaven, until the very end of the Warhammer world itself. But there would be no peace within the Skaven and their empire. For as long as Skaven ruled Skaven, then there would always be infighting. So much so that when lost clans would return from their travels back, and their leaders demanding a seat on the Council of 13, Skaven civil wars, the first of many to be exact, would begin. The perfect example of this would be Clan Pestilence, who upon returning from the lands of Lustria demanded a seat upon the council, which ultimately led to a massive scale Skaven civil war. These matters eventually came to a conclusion when Pestilence got what they wanted. But despite this, it proves that the Skaven, try as they might, would never be truly united. The Skaven would launch attacks upon the surface world many times, to varying degrees of success. Thankfully, to them, they would always stay relatively unknown, for the Great Ascendancy was yet to come. And unfortunately, it was delayed various times by the Skaven themselves via multiple civil wars, which even saw the disbanding of the Lords of Decay. This saw the Skaven reverting from an organized fighting force to small clans of infighting rats. This would have destroyed all of Skavendom, yet thankfully, as part of yet another civil war, the Council of 13 was reformed, and once again the Skaven would fight alongside each other. In loose terms, mind you. I rather go into details regarding the civil wars in their own videos, as they are quite detailed and would probably deserve their own videos. This was pretty much a video just to breach into Skaven lore, from the very beginning till about a time that they were still unknown, but they were preparing for their assaults. Naturally, as time also progresses, I will also touch upon each of the big Skaven clans, as well as the minor ones, as I've been doing with other videos. Don't worry, the big 4 clans require at least 20, 30, 40 minute long videos, depending on the clan. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you all again very, very soon.